Across the galaxy, there exists a simple rule that every civilized species follows without question. Never cage a human. Not because they're particularly strong, not because they're especially intelligent, and certainly not because they're the most advanced species in the cosmos. No, the rule exists because humans possess something far more dangerous than any weapon or technology. They have hope. And hope, as the universe has learned through countless tragedies, makes humans do impossible things. The Dracari Empire, in their arrogance, forgot this rule. They thought their bioengineered dragon warriors were apex predators. They thought their quantum-locked cells could hold anything. They thought wrong. What they captured wasn't just another soft-skinned alien. What they locked away in the deepest, darkest corner of their maximum security facility was something that would remind the galaxy why humans are whispered about in the same breath as cosmic forces and natural disasters. This is the story of Marcus Chun, an ordinary maintenance engineer who became extraordinary simply because someone made the mistake of putting him in a cage next to creatures that had given up hope. And in the darkness of that alien prison, surrounded by the broken spirits of dragon-like beings who once ruled the stars, something awakened in the human that even he didn't know existed. The Dracari would soon learn that there are fates worse than death. There is the wrath of a human who has found something worth fighting for. The neural disruptor's afterglow faded from Marcus Chin's vision as consciousness crept back into his battered body. Cold metal pressed against his cheek, and the taste of copper filled his mouth. The last thing he remembered was the emergency beacon screaming through the corridors of Mining Station Epsilon 7, followed by the impossible sight of massive, scaled creatures tearing through reinforced bulkheads like paper. Now, as his eyes adjusted to the dim, purple lighting, Marcus realized he was no longer on the station. The architecture around him was organic, flowing like bone-grown rather than metal-forged. Bioluminescent veins pulsed through the walls, casting eerie shadows that seemed to writhe and dance. The air itself felt different, thicker, with an oily quality that made each breath a conscious effort. He was in a cell. That much was obvious. The barrier in front of him shimmered with the telltale distortion of an energy field, and beyond it stretched a corridor lined with similar containment units. But what made his blood run cold wasn't the prison itself. It was what occupied the cell across from his. A dragon. An actual, living dragon. The creature was massive, easily 15 feet from snout to tail, with scales that shifted color like oil on water. Its wings were folded tight against its body, and even in the confined space, Marcus could see the raw power coiled in its muscular frame. But what struck him most were its eyes. They held an intelligence that was unmistakably sentient, unmistakably aware. And in that intelligence, Marcus saw something that made his chest tighten with unexpected emotion: defeat. The dragon's head turned slowly toward him, and when it spoke, its voice resonated through the chamber with a deep, musical quality that seemed to bypass his ears and speak directly to his bones. Another prisoner for the Dracari's collection, the dragon said, its words heavily accented but perfectly understandable. Tell me, small creature, what crime earned you a place in the Crimson Depths? Marcus struggled to his feet, ignoring the protests from his bruised ribs. I was just doing my job. Maintenance on a mining station. Then these things attacked. Scale monsters with weapons I'd never seen before. A sound that might have been laughter rumbled from the dragon's throat, but there was no humor in it. Dracari raiders. They collect specimens for their war machine. Some for experimentation, some for gladiatorial combat, some... The dragon's voice trailed off, and its great head turned away. Some for purposes best left unspoken. You're not one of them. Marcus asked, studying the dragon's features more carefully. Now that he looked closer, he could see subtle differences. Where the raiders had been purely predatory, this creature possessed a nobility that spoke of higher purposes. I am Zephyr of the astral winds, last free son of the elder scale September, the dragon replied with quiet dignity. Or I was before the Drakkari ambushed my patrol ship 3 cycles ago. Now I'm simply another trophy in their collection, waiting for whatever fate amuses them. Marcus looked around the prison with new understanding. In the cells he could now see there were dozens of different species. Some he recognized from the galactic databases. Centauri merchants with their distinctive blue skin, insectoid hive singers with their chitinous carapaces, even what looked like a crystalline entity that pulsed with internal light. Others were completely alien to him, beings of shapes and configurations that challenged his understanding of what life could become. But they all shared one thing in common: the same defeated posture, the same hollow look in their eyes that he'd seen in Zephyr. They had given up. "How long have you all been here?" Marcus asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. "Time moves strangely in this place," Zephyr replied. The Drakkari used temporal distortion fields to manage their prisoners. What feels like days to us might be weeks or months in the outside galaxy. Some of these souls have been here for what feels like years. Marcus pressed his palm against the energy barrier, feeling the slight tingle of the containment field. "And no one's ever escaped?" The dragon's laugh was bitter this time. "Escape? Little creature, you misunderstand the nature of our captivity. These are not merely cages. They are quantum-locked containment fields powered by dark matter reactors. The walls are grown from living metal that adapts to any attempt at breach. The guards are bioengineered Drakkari warriors who can track a heartbeat from 3 sectors away. This facility exists in a pocket dimension, accessible only through portals controlled by the High Command." Marcus absorbed this information, his engineering mind automatically cataloging the details. Quantum locks suggested quantum solutions. Living metal implied biological vulnerabilities. Pocket dimensions required massive energy expenditures and had to follow certain physical laws, even if they were artificially maintained. "But you tried," he said. It wasn't a question. Zephyr's eyes met his again, and for a moment, Marcus saw a flicker of the fire that had once burned there. "In the early days, yes. I still believed freedom was possible. I coordinated with other prisoners, mapped guard rotations, studied the facility's weaknesses. But every attempt ended in failure, and each failure cost lives." The dragon's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. "After a time, one learns that hope is a luxury that only leads to greater suffering." Marcus sat down on the metal floor, leaning against the back wall of his cell. The rational part of his mind agreed with Zephyr's assessment. He was a maintenance engineer, not a warrior or a spy. He had no special training, no advanced weapons, no superhuman abilities. By any reasonable measure, he was probably going to die in this place. But as he looked around at the defeated faces in the surrounding cells, something stirred in his chest. It wasn't anger, though there was plenty of that. It wasn't fear, though that was present too. It was something more fundamental, more essentially human. It was stubbornness. "Tell me about the guards," Marcus said quietly. Zephyr's head turned sharply toward him. "What?" "The guards. Their routines, their numbers, their weaknesses. Tell me everything you know." The dragon studied him for a long moment, and Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out behind those ancient eyes. Hope was dangerous. Hope led to pain. But perhaps, somewhere deep down, the fire hadn't been completely extinguished. "There are 12 primary guards," Zephyr said slowly, as if the words were being pulled from him against his will. They rotate in shifts of 6, with overlapping patrols every 4 time units. They are bioengineered variants of the base Drackery stock, faster, stronger, with enhanced senses and natural armor plating. Marcus nodded, filing away the information. What about their equipment? Neural disruptors, primarily, effective against most nervous systems. They also carry containment projectors, portable versions of our cell barriers. And Zephyr hesitated. And pain amplifiers, devices that can inflict agony without physical damage, ensuring prisoners remain alive for whatever purposes their masters intend. Marcus felt his jaw tighten, but he kept his voice level. Okay, what about the facility itself? Layout, power systems, environmental controls. By now, several other prisoners had begun to listen to their conversation. Marcus could see faces pressed against energy barriers, eyes that hadn't held interest in anything for months or years suddenly, focusing on the small human who was asking all the wrong questions. Or maybe all the right ones. Zephyr seemed to realize the same thing. Human, he said, and there was something different in his voice now. Not hope, not yet, but perhaps the memory of what hope had once felt like. What exactly are you planning? Marcus looked around the prison, taking in every detail he could observe. The spacing of the cells, the thickness of the walls, the color variations in the bioluminescent veins that suggested different power distribution patterns. His mind was already working, cataloging, and analyzing, and beginning to form the skeleton of what might charitably be called a plan. I'm planning to get out of here, he said simply, and I'm planning to take everyone with me. The silence that followed his words was deafening, not just from Zephyr, but from every prisoner within earshot. Marcus could feel their stares like physical weights, could sense the careful balance between desperate hope and crushing despair that his words had created. It was Zephyr who finally broke the silence, and when he spoke, his voice carried a warning that seemed to echo with the weight of bitter experience. Hope is the cruelest torture of all, Marcus Chun. It will consume you from within and leave nothing but ash and regret. I've seen it happen to dozens of good souls in this place. I will not watch it happen to you. Marcus met the dragon's gaze steadily. Then don't watch. Help. Something shifted in the ancient creature's expression. Not hope. Not yet. But perhaps the first crack in the wall of despair that had been built by years of captivity and failed dreams. The guard will come soon for their evening inspection, Zephyr said quietly. They will notice you are awake and will want to catalog their new acquisition. Observe them carefully, human. Learn their patterns. But do not let them see you learning. Marcus nodded, settling back against the wall of his cell. Around him, the other prisoners were doing the same, but he could sense the change in the atmosphere. The suffocating weight of defeat had lifted just slightly, replaced by something that hadn't been present in this place for a very long time. Possibility. As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of heavy footsteps began to echo down the corridor. The other prisoners immediately assumed postures of submission, heads down, eyes averted. But Marcus noticed that their positions had shifted slightly, allowing them better lines of sight to observe what was about to unfold. The guards came into view, and Marcus got his first clear look at what the Drackery had made of themselves. They were humanoid in basic structure, but stretched and modified until they more closely resembled walking nightmares. Their skin was scaled and armored, their limbs elongated and ending in claws designed for rending. Their eyes glowed with artificial enhancements, and when they moved, they did so with a fluid grace that spoke of predatory efficiency. But Marcus was an engineer, and Engineers saw things differently than most people. Where others might see perfect killers, he saw biological systems with inherent limitations. Enhanced senses meant sensory overload vulnerabilities. Natural armor implied decreased flexibility at joint points. Extended limbs suggested leverage points that could be exploited. The lead guard stopped in front of Marcus's cell, and when it spoke, its voice was a synthesized rasp that sounded like grinding metal. "The human is awake." "Good." The experimentation division was eager to begin their work. Marcus kept his expression neutral, but internally, he was already beginning to plan. Experimentation meant they would have to remove him from the cell. That would be his first opportunity. The guard moved on after a moment, continuing its inspection of the other prisoners. Marcus watched carefully, noting patrol patterns, observing the way they interacted with different cell configurations, cataloging every detail that might prove useful. When the guards finally left, the silence that settled over the prison was different from before. It carried an electric quality, a sense of anticipation that hadn't existed for years. "Experimentation Division," Zephyr said quietly from his cell across the corridor. "They will come for you tomorrow, or perhaps the day after." They preferred to let new prisoners marinate in fear for a time before beginning their work. Marcus didn't respond immediately. He was too busy thinking, planning, calculating probabilities and possibilities. When he finally spoke, his words were so quiet that only those in the nearest cells could hear them. "Tell me about the experimentation process. Everything you know about how they transport prisoners, where they take them, what security measures are in place." And as Zephyr began to speak, sharing knowledge that had been gathered through pain and loss and desperate observation, Marcus Chun began to build something that the Dracari in their arrogance had never anticipated. He began to build hope. The other prisoners listened in silence, afraid to believe, but unable to stop themselves from imagining what freedom might look like. They didn't know yet what they were witnessing: the birth of something that would shake the foundations of the Dracari Empire and remind the galaxy why humans had earned their reputation as the universe's most dangerous species. Not because they were the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because they were too stubborn to know when they were supposed to give up. The extraction came on what Marcus estimated was his third day in captivity, though the artificial lighting and temporal distortions made it impossible to be certain. He had spent the intervening time gathering intelligence from his fellow prisoners, learning about the facility's layout, guard routines, and the various horrific purposes their captors had in store for different species. The experimentation division's transport protocols were brutally efficient. 6 guards surrounded Marcus's cell as the energy barrier flickered and died. Before he could move, neural disruptors bathed him in paralyzing energy, leaving him conscious but unable to control his muscles. They lifted him onto a hovering transport gurney and secured him with restraints that seemed to anticipate any possible escape attempt. As they moved through the facility's corridors, Marcus forced himself to remain calm and observant despite the terror clawing at the edges of his consciousness. The bioorganic architecture was even more disturbing up close, with walls that actually seemed to pulse with life, and ceiling formations that reminded him uncomfortably of rib cages. Occasionally, they passed viewing ports that showed the swirling chaos of the pocket dimension beyond, a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and geometries that hurt to look at directly. The experimentation division was housed in a section of the facility that felt different from the prison levels. Where the cells had been designed for containment, this area was built for access. Wider corridors, multiple branching paths, and, most importantly, several emergency stations with equipment that Marcus's engineering I immediately recognized as environmental controls and power distribution nodes. They brought him to a circular chamber dominated by a massive examination table surrounded by arrays of instruments that defied easy classification. Some looked medical, others resembled scanning equipment, and a few were so alien in design that Marcus couldn't even guess at their function. The walls were lined with storage units containing specimens in various states of preservation, a grisly museum of the division's previous work. Dr. Vexthar, the lead researcher, was waiting for them. Unlike the guards with their obvious modifications for violence, the doctor represented a different branch of Dracry evolution. His frame was more slender, his movements precise rather than predatory, and his eyes held the cold intelligence of someone who viewed the universe as an endless series of fascinating problems to be solved through careful dissection. "Ah, our human specimen," Dr. Vexthar said, his voice carrying a cultured accent that somehow made his words more disturbing rather than less. Species classification, Homo sapiens. Origin, Sol system, third planet. Designation, moderate threat level, suitable for cognitive enhancement studies and stress response analysis. The neural disruptor's effects began to wear off as they transferred Marcus to the examination table. He could feel sensation returning to his extremities, but he remained still, feigning continued paralysis while he assessed his situation. The restraints were biomechanical, responding to muscle tension and electrical impulses to tighten automatically if he struggled. The examination table itself was clearly designed to accommodate a wide variety of anatomies, with adjustment capabilities that could restrain anything from a gas phase entity to a crystalline life form. Dr. Vexthar approached with a scanner that hummed with barely contained energy. "We shall begin with basic physiological mapping. Your species has proven remarkably adaptable in previous encounters, and we're eager to understand the mechanisms behind this flexibility." The scanner's beam played across Marcus's body, and he could see his vital statistics appearing on nearby displays. Heart rate, brain activity, cellular structure, everything laid bare under the alien technology's penetrating gaze. But Marcus wasn't thinking about the violation of privacy. He was thinking about power consumption. The scanning array was drawing massive amounts of energy, enough that he could see fluctuations in the facility's ambient lighting. More importantly, it was networked to other systems throughout the division, creating potential cascade points if something were to go wrong with the power distribution. "Interesting," Dr. Vexthar murmured, studying the readouts. "Your stress hormones are elevated, as expected, but your cognitive patterns show unusual stability for a species under duress. Most specimens at this stage are either catatonic with fear or thrashing uselessly against their restraints." Marcus allowed himself a slight smile. "Maybe we're just more curious than most." The doctor's eyes gleamed with interest. Verbal response indicates retained consciousness despite neural disruptor exposure. Remarkable recovery time. Make a note for enhanced dosage protocols in future acquisitions. One of the assistant researchers moved to comply, but Marcus was already filing away that information. Enhanced dosages meant they would adjust their tactics, but it also meant they had recognized humans as different from their usual prey. That recognition was a weapon he could use if he was clever about it. The examination continued for what felt like hours. They took tissue samples, conducted cognitive tests, and subjected him to various forms of sensory input designed to map his nervous system's responses. Through it all, Marcus maintained a careful balance, cooperative enough to avoid triggering more aggressive restraint measures, but observant enough to gather critical intelligence about the facility's weaknesses. The breakthrough came when Dr. Vexthar decided to test his specimen's problem-solving abilities. They presented Marcus with a series of puzzles, each more complex than the last, monitoring his brain activity as he worked through the solutions. The tests were clearly designed for multiple species, with options for everything from mathematical logic to pattern recognition to spatial reasoning. Marcus solved them all. Not just solved them, but solved them quickly and efficiently, often finding alternate approaches that the original designers hadn't anticipated. He could see the excitement building in Dr. Vexthar's posture as the results came in, could practically feel the researcher's mind racing with the implications of what he was observing. Extraordinary, the doctor breathed, studying the neural scans. Your problem-solving pathways show activation patterns we've never recorded. Most species tend toward either analytical or intuitive approaches, but you're using both simultaneously. It's as if your brain is running multiple processing systems in parallel. Marcus filed that information away as well. If humans were unique in their cognitive flexibility, that might explain why they had been flagged as specimens worth collecting rather than simply being eliminated as potential threats. The revelation came when Dr. Vexthar brought out what he called the cooperation matrix, a complex puzzle that required multiple participants working together to solve. Since Marcus was alone, the doctor activated holographic projections of previous test subjects, allowing him to interact with recorded responses from other prisoners. As Marcus worked through the puzzle, coordinating with the phantom images of his fellow captives, something inside him clicked into place. He wasn't just solving the puzzle. He was learning how each species thought, how they approached problems, what their strengths and limitations were. The Dracari, in their eagerness to understand him, were inadvertently giving him the keys to understanding everyone else. And understanding, Marcus realized, was the first step toward leadership. When the testing session finally ended, they returned him to his cell with the same brutal efficiency they had used to extract him. But this time, Marcus was ready. As the neural disruptors fired, he had already begun implementing a technique he had developed during the examination, a method of compartmentalizing his consciousness that allowed him to maintain awareness even while his body was paralyzed. The guards noticed nothing unusual as they secured him back in his containment unit. To them, he was just another specimen returned to storage after processing. They had no idea that their prisoner was now carrying detailed intelligence about the facility's power grid, security protocols, and, most importantly, the psychological profiles of every species held in the Crimson Depths. Marcus! Zephyr's voice reached him as soon as the guards had departed. The dragon's tone was carefully neutral, but Marcus could hear the underlying tension. Are you intact? Marcus tested his returning motor functions, flexing his fingers and rotating his shoulders to work out the stiffness. I'm fine. Better than fine, actually. We need to talk. Over the next several hours, Marcus shared what he had learned, but more importantly, he began to share what he had realized. The Dracari saw their prisoners as specimens, categorizing them by species and threat level and behavioral patterns. But that categorization was also a blindness. It prevented them from seeing the individuals behind the classifications, and, more critically, it prevented them from anticipating how those individuals might work together. The power grid, Marcus explained to the growing circle of listeners, is designed for efficiency, not redundancy. They've got massive generators feeding into distribution nodes throughout the facility, but if you overload one node, it cascades to the others. The whole system could crash if you hit it right. A Centauri merchant named Caxtel leaned forward in his cell. Even if we could cause such a cascade, the backup systems would engage within moments. We would gain nothing but a few minutes of darkness. Not if we time it right. Marcus replied. The backup systems are biomechanical, just like everything else here. They need time to boot up, and they need manual activation from the control center. During my examination, I saw the power consumption patterns. There's a vulnerability window every time they run a major experiment. Zephyr's eyes had begun to glow with something that might have been the beginning of hope. You're suggesting we coordinate our escape attempt with their research schedule. I'm suggesting we do more than that, Marcus said quietly. I'm suggesting we turn their own systems against them. The plan that emerged over the following conversations was complex, dangerous, and required precise timing from dozens of participants. But it was also something the Drackery would never expect, a coordinated resistance effort led by a species they considered only moderately threatening. Marcus had learned during his examination that humans were classified as adaptive problem solvers with moderate physical capabilities and strong social bonding tendencies. The Drackery saw the social bonding as a weakness, an exploitable attachment that could be used to control human behavior. They had no idea that it was actually humanity's greatest strength, because humans didn't just solve problems individually. They solved them collectively, building on each other's ideas, compensating for each other's weaknesses, and creating solutions that were greater than the sum of their parts. And in the depths of the Crimson Depths, surrounded by the broken representatives of 100 species, Marcus Chun began to do what humans had always done best. He began to build a community. Not just a group of desperate prisoners plotting escape, but a genuine community united by shared purpose and mutual support. He helped resolve conflicts between incompatible species, found ways for natural enemies to work together toward common goals, and slowly but surely began to kindle something that hadn't existed in this place for years. Hope. Real hope, based not on desperate wishful thinking, but on careful planning and collective effort. The transformation wasn't immediate or universal. Some prisoners had been broken too thoroughly to believe in any possibility of freedom. Others were too alien in their thinking to fully grasp the concepts Marcus was trying to convey. But enough believed, enough participated, enough began to hope that the atmosphere of the prison started to change. The guards noticed the change, but misinterpreted it completely. They saw increased conversation between prisoners and assumed it was simple socialization brought on by the humans' presence. They saw improved morale and attributed it to the natural resilience of certain species. They saw the beginnings of organization and dismissed it as harmless prisoner bonding. They had no idea they were witnessing the birth of something that would bring down their entire empire. Because the Drackery, for all their biological enhancements and technological advancement, had made one critical error in their understanding of the galaxy's species. They thought that intelligence and physical capability were the primary determinants of threat level. They had never encountered a species that specialized in making other species more than they were individually. They had never met humans. And now, in the deepest, most secure facility in their empire, Marcus Chin was about to show them what happened when you gave humans something to fight for and something to protect. The lessons from Dr. Vextar's experiments had taught him how each species thought and reacted. The intelligence gathered during transport had shown him the facility's vulnerabilities. The bonds formed with his fellow prisoners had given him the most powerful weapon of all, trust. Now it was time to put it all together and remind the universe why humanity had earned its place among the stars, not through conquest or superior technology, but through something far more dangerous, the ability to inspire others to be more than they ever thought possible. The opportunity came sooner than expected. Dr. Vexthar's enthusiasm for his human specimen had apparently impressed his superiors, because within days of Marcus's first examination, word filtered through the prison's communication network that the experimentation division was being granted additional resources for an expanded research program. This intelligence came from an unlikely source, a crystalline entity called Resonance of Deep Thought, whose natural ability to detect electromagnetic fluctuations allowed it to eavesdrop on the facility's internal communications. Most species would have kept such valuable information to themselves, hoarding it as a potential bargaining chip for better treatment. But Marcus had spent considerable effort building trust with the crystal being, learning about its culture, and finding ways to make it feel valued and respected. The crystalline spoke in harmonic frequencies that most species couldn't even perceive, but Marcus had discovered that by listening carefully to the subtle vibrations in the cell walls, he could make out basic concepts. More importantly, he had taught Zephyr and several others how to interpret these vibrations, creating a communication network that the guards couldn't monitor. The power allocation will increase by 40% during the next major experiment cycle, Resonance sang, its faceted form pulsing with agitated light. They intend to run simultaneous tests on multiple high-value specimens. The energy draw will push the primary generators to near maximum capacity. Marcus absorbed this information while maintaining the appearance of casual conversation with his cellmates. The guards were accustomed to prisoner chatter by now, dismissing it as harmless social bonding. They had no idea that each seemingly random conversation was actually a carefully orchestrated intelligence briefing. When Marcus asked, pitching his voice to match the harmonic frequency that carried best through the cell barriers. 3 cycles hence. The preparation begins tomorrow. Perfect. That gave them just enough time to implement the plan they had been developing, but not so much time that they would risk discovery or lose momentum. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that always accompanied the transition from planning to action. This was the moment when theoretical possibilities became life-or-death realities. Over the next day, Marcus moved through the prison like a conductor preparing an orchestra. Each species had been assigned specific roles based on their unique capabilities, and each role was critical to the overall success of the plan. The beauty of the strategy was its redundancy. If one element failed, others could compensate, and the Drakkari would never see the full scope of what was coming until it was too late. The hive singers, with their natural ability to coordinate through pheromone communication, would serve as the timing mechanism. Their chemical signals could pass through the energy barriers and provide precise synchronization across the entire facility. They had been practicing their sequences for days, developing a complex olfactory language that could convey everything from ready to abort to now. The Centauri merchants contributed their expertise in systems analysis. Their species had built their interstellar trading empire on the ability to quickly assess and exploit inefficiencies in any system, whether economic, technological, or social. They had identified 17 separate vulnerabilities in the prison's design, ranking them by exploitability and potential impact. Zephyr and the other draconic prisoners brought raw power and tactical knowledge to the equation. Despite their defeat and captivity, they retained their warrior instincts and their understanding of combat dynamics. More importantly, their natural resistance to energy weapons meant they could serve as shock troops if the situation devolved into direct confrontation. Even a more exotic species had crucial roles to play. A gas phase entity called Whisper of Distant Stars could infiltrate the facility's atmospheric systems and disrupt life support to specific areas. A collective consciousness, known as the Merged Ones, could overwhelm localized computer networks, through sheer processing power. Each prisoner had something to contribute, and Marcus had found ways to weave all those contributions into a coherent strategy. But the most important element of the plan wasn't any specific capability or technique. It was something more fundamental: trust. For the first time in years, these prisoners believed in something bigger than their individual survival. They believed in each other, and they believed in the possibility of freedom. The transformation was visible in ways both subtle and obvious. Postures straightened, voices gained strength, and the defeated shuffle that had characterized prisoner movement gave way to purposeful coordination. The guards noticed, but misinterpreted the change, attributing it to improved morale following the addition of the interesting human specimen to their collection. Dr. Vexthar was particularly pleased with the results of his research program. His reports to the High Command glowed with praise for human cognitive flexibility and the species' apparent ability to form rapid social bonds with other prisoners. He recommended immediate expansion of the human acquisition program, suggesting that additional specimens would provide valuable insights into the mechanics of interspecies cooperation. The irony was almost painful. The Dracary's greatest strength, their systematic analytical approach to understanding and controlling other species, had become their greatest weakness. They were so focused on cataloging and categorizing that they missed the forest for the trees. They saw individual prisoners adapting to captivity, but they couldn't see the community that was forming around those adaptations. Marcus used their blindness against them, carefully orchestrating the final preparations while maintaining the appearance of resigned captivity. He coached his fellow prisoners on the importance of timing, redundancy, and adaptability. Plans could go wrong. Equipment could fail. Guards could appear where they weren't expected. Success would depend not on perfect execution, but on the ability to improvise and support each other when the unexpected inevitably occurred. The night before the operation, Marcus found himself staring through the viewing ports at the chaotic swirl of the pocket dimension beyond. The sight should have been terrifying, a reminder of how far from home he was, how impossible escape seemed, how completely he was at the mercy of forces beyond his understanding or control. Instead, he felt something he hadn't experienced since childhood: the electric anticipation that came from being part of something larger than himself. He wasn't just Marcus Chun anymore, maintenance engineer from Mining Station Epsilon 7. He was the focal point of a community that had chosen to believe in tomorrow despite every rational reason to surrender to despair. Second thoughts. Zephyr's voice carried across the space between their cells, pitched low enough that only Marcus could hear. Marcus turned away from the viewing port and met the dragon's ancient eyes. No, just appreciation, I guess, for all of this, for everyone who's choosing to believe. Zephyr was quiet for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried harmonics that Marcus had never heard before, something that spoke of deep emotion carefully controlled. In my culture, there's a concept that has no direct translation into your language. The closest approximation would be the fire that burns in darkness. It refers to the spark of hope that persists even when all logical reason for hope has been extinguished. The dragon paused, and Marcus could see the internal struggle playing out behind those intelligent eyes. I thought that fire had died in me long ago, Zephyr continued. I thought the Dracary had taken everything: my freedom, my purpose, my belief in the possibility of justice. But watching you these past days, seeing what you've built here with nothing but words and trust and stubborn refusal to accept defeat. The dragon's voice trailed off for a moment. Perhaps the fire was only sleeping. Marcus felt a tightness in his throat that had nothing to do with the facility's artificial atmosphere. Tomorrow, we're all going to remember what it feels like to burn bright. Around them, the prison settled into its nighttime rhythms. Guards switched to skeleton crews. Automated systems took over most monitoring functions, and the bioluminescent veins in the walls dimmed to simulate a natural day-night cycle. But beneath the appearance of routine slumber, nearly 100 prisoners were making final preparations for an operation that would either set them free or kill them all in the attempt. Marcus closed his eyes and ran through the plan one more time, visualizing each stage, each contingency, each point where success balanced on the edge of disaster. They would have one chance and one chance only. If they failed, the Drackery would implement security measures that would make future escape attempts impossible. Worse, they would likely separate the prisoners, breaking up the community that had become Marcus's greatest achievement. But failure wasn't an option he allowed himself to dwell on. Instead, he focused on the dozens of conversations he'd had over the past days, the trust that had been freely given, the hope that had been carefully nurtured from the ashes of despair. These beings had chosen to believe in him, and, more importantly, they had chosen to believe in each other. The Drackery had made many mistakes in their handling of their prisoners, but their greatest error was in their fundamental understanding of what they were dealing with. They saw a collection of defeated specimens, cataloged by species and sorted by utility. They thought they were managing a resource. They had no idea they had created an army. Dawn came with artificial lighting that gradually increased to simulate planetary sunrise, and with it came the final preparations for Dr. Vexthar's expanded research program. Marcus could hear the increased activity in the corridors, could feel the vibrations through the facility's bioorganic structure as additional equipment was brought online. Power consumption was already climbing toward the critical thresholds that Resonance of Deep Thought had identified, and they hadn't even begun the actual experiments yet. Everything was falling into place exactly as they had hoped. The first test subjects were extracted from their cells according to standard protocols, but Marcus noted subtle differences in timing and coordination that told him his fellow prisoners were already implementing their assigned roles. The hive singers had begun releasing preparatory pheromones, chemical signals that would prime everyone for coordinated action. The Centauri were monitoring facility systems through methods Marcus didn't fully understand but had learned to trust. Even the most exotic prisoners were making their own unique contributions to the collective effort. When the guards came for Marcus, he was ready. As the neural disruptors fired and his voluntary motor functions shut down, he implemented the consciousness compartmentalization technique he had perfected, maintaining awareness while his body appeared completely paralyzed. They loaded him onto the transport gurney and began moving toward the experimentation division, but this time, Marcus wasn't just observing their route for intelligence purposes. This time, he was counting down the minutes until the most audacious prison break in galactic history began in earnest. The Drackery had thought they understood humans, adaptive problem solvers with strong social tendencies. They were right, as far as it went, but they had missed the most important part of that description. Humans didn't just adapt to their environment. When necessary, they adapted their environment to themselves, and they never, ever did it alone. The examination chamber hummed with barely controlled energy as Dr. Vexthar prepared for what he considered the pinnacle of his research career. Multiple specimens from different species had been arranged throughout the facility, each one destined for specific tests designed to push the boundaries of xenobiological understanding. The power grid was operating at 93% capacity, just shy of the critical threshold that would trigger automatic safety protocols. Marcus lay strapped to the central examination table, his his body paralyzed, but his mind crystal clear as he tracked the escalating energy readings on the surrounding displays. Through the facility's bioorganic walls, he could feel the subtle vibrations that indicated his fellow prisoners were moving into position according to their assigned timelines. The hive singers had begun releasing the coordination pheromones that would synchronize the coming chaos across dozens of separate cells. Everything depended on timing now. Dr. Vexthar approached with his usual air of scientific enthusiasm, accompanied by a team of research assistants who were busy calibrating exotic scanning equipment. Today we explore the limits of human neuroplasticity under extreme stress conditions, the doctor announced to his team. The specimen has already demonstrated remarkable cognitive flexibility. Let us discover what happens when we push those capabilities beyond their normal operational parameters. Marcus forced himself to remain motionless as they positioned additional restraints and sensor arrays around his body. The irony wasn't lost on him. They were about to discover exactly what happened when you pushed human capabilities beyond normal parameters, just not in the way they expected. The first phase of their plan activated while Dr. Vexthar was still adjusting his scanning equipment. Deep in the facility's lower levels, Whisper of Distant Stars had begun infiltrating the atmospheric processing systems. The gas phase entity's natural ability to exist as a controlled atmospheric disturbance made it nearly impossible to detect, and its understanding of environmental controls allowed it to make subtle adjustments that wouldn't trigger immediate alarms. Oxygen levels began dropping in the guard stations, while rising in the prisoner sections. Carbon dioxide was redirected away from critical life support areas and channeled into the guards' rest facilities. The changes were gradual enough to avoid triggering emergency protocols, but significant enough to begin affecting the alertness and response times of the facility's security personnel. Marcus felt the slight change in air quality even in the examination chamber, and he knew that across the prison, his fellow conspirators were feeling it too, a literal breath of fresh air that signaled the beginning of their liberation attempt. Dr. Vexthar noticed nothing unusual as he activated the first scanner, sending cascades of exotic energy through Marcus's nervous system. The readings that appeared on his displays showed elevated stress hormones and increased neural activity, exactly what he expected from a specimen undergoing intense examination. He had no way of knowing that the stress response he was observing was actually focused anticipation and carefully controlled excitement. The second phase began as power consumption crossed the 95% threshold. Throughout the facility, the Centauri merchants were implementing their systematic exploitation of design flaws they had identified in the Dracari security systems. Using techniques that had made their species the galaxy's premier traders, they began introducing cascading inefficiencies into the prison's operational matrix. Caxtel, working from his cell using nothing but his species' natural ability to manipulate electromagnetic fields through precise bioelectric control, began overloading the data processing nodes that controlled cell barrier calibration. The barriers themselves remained active, but the systems that monitored their integrity began generating false readings and error messages that demanded increasingly sophisticated diagnostic routines. Security technicians found themselves dealing with dozens of minor system alerts that appeared to be routine maintenance issues, but actually represented carefully orchestrated attacks on the facility's operational efficiency. Each malfunction required investigation, drawing personnel away from their normal duties and creating gaps in the surveillance grid. Marcus watched Dr. Vexthar's growing frustration as the research equipment began experiencing intermittent power fluctuations. The scanner readings were becoming inconsistent, and several diagnostic systems were reporting conflicting data about his specimen's physiological state. The doctor recalibrated his instruments repeatedly, convinced that equipment malfunction was interfering with his research. He was partially right. Equipment was malfunctioning throughout the facility, but it wasn't random failure. It was systematic sabotage orchestrated by prisoners who had spent years observing their captors' systems and were now exploiting every weakness they had discovered. The third phase activated when facility power consumption hit 98% and the backup generators began their startup sequences. This was the moment Marcus had been waiting for, the narrow window when the Drakkari systems were most vulnerable to coordinated attack. Resonance of deep thought, whose crystalline form could interface directly with the facility's bioorganic computer networks, began the most critical part of the operation. The entity's natural ability to process information at quantum speeds allowed it to infiltrate the prison's control systems and begin rewriting fundamental operational protocols. Security cameras began experiencing routine diagnostic cycles that created blind spots in surveillance coverage. Door locks started implementing preventive maintenance routines that would delay their response to emergency override commands. Most importantly, the containment field generators began running efficiency optimization programs that would cause catastrophic feedback loops when combined with the facility's already strained power grid. Dr. Vex Thar was becoming increasingly agitated as his equipment continued to malfunction. Several of his most sophisticated instruments had shut down completely, while others were producing readings so bizarre that they defied scientific explanation. He had no idea that the readings were actually accurate. Marcus's body was responding to the approaching moment of liberation in ways that the doctor's xenobiology textbooks had never anticipated. Human physiology under extreme stress could produce capabilities that bordered on the superhuman. Adrenaline could provide short bursts of incredible strength. Desperate focus could enhance sensory perception beyond normal ranges. And, most importantly, the human nervous system's remarkable plasticity could adapt to alien neural disruptor technology in ways that no other species had ever demonstrated. Marcus felt the change beginning as his fellow prisoners implemented the final stages of their coordinated plan. The compartmentalization technique he had developed during his previous examinations was evolving, becoming something more than just a method of maintaining consciousness. His nervous system was literally adapting to the alien technology that held him paralyzed, learning its patterns and beginning to resist its effects. The fourth phase erupted across the facility as nearly 100 prisoners began their coordinated breakout attempt. The timing was perfect, power systems strained to their limits, security personnel distracted by false alarms, surveillance networks compromised, and backup systems still cycling through their startup routines. Zephyr's roar echoed through the prison levels as the ancient dragon channeled every ounce of his remaining strength against the compromised containment field that held him. The barrier, already weakened by resonance of deep thought's infiltration programs and destabilized by the power grid's fluctuations, collapsed under the assault. For the first time in years, the last free son of the Elder Scale September spread his wings and remembered what it felt like to be dangerous. The draconic prisoners weren't alone in their liberation. Throughout the facility, containment fields were failing as the sabotage power systems cascaded toward total collapse. The merged ones burst from their collective cell in a wave of coordinated consciousness that overwhelmed every computer network they encountered. The crystalline entities sang harmonics that shattered bioorganic barriers and sent resonant frequencies through the facility's living walls. But It was the cooperation between species that truly terrified the guards who tried to respond to the crisis. They had been trained to deal with individual escape attempts or small group breakouts. They had no protocols for a coordinated rebellion involving dozens of different species working in perfect synchronization. Centauri merchants provided tactical analysis, while hive singers coordinated movement through pheromone signals. Gas phase entities created atmospheric disturbances that confused tracking systems, while crystalline beings generated electromagnetic interference that blinded sensors. Dragon fire provided covering force, while exotic entities exploited weaknesses that the guards didn't even know existed. Marcus felt Dr. Vexthar's shock as alarms began screaming throughout the examination chamber. The doctor's voice cracked as he tried to contact security, his scientific detachment finally crumbling under the realization that his research facility was under attack from the inside. Containment breach in sectors 7 through 12 came the panicked voice from the facility's communication system. Multiple species involved, unknown coordination methods, requesting immediate reinforcement from all available. The transmission cut off abruptly as whisper of distant stars flooded the communication center with a precisely calibrated atmospheric disturbance that rendered electronic equipment temporarily inoperative. The gas phase entity had learned the hard way that information was the Dracary's greatest weapon. Controlling what they could and couldn't communicate was essential to the prisoner's success. Marcus chose that moment to implement the final stage of his personal escape plan. The neural disruptor technology that held him paralyzed had been designed for normal biological systems operating under standard stress conditions. It had never been tested against a human nervous system that had spent days adapting to its effects while simultaneously being pushed to its absolute limits by circumstances that would have broken most sentient beings. Dr. Vexthar's instruments registered impossible readings as Marcus began to move despite the neural disruptors that should have kept him completely immobilized. Muscle fibers that should have been locked in paralysis began to respond to nerve impulses that should have been completely blocked. It wasn't magic or superhuman mutation. It was adaptation, the fundamental characteristic that had allowed humanity to survive and thrive in environments that destroyed other species. The restraints that held Marcus to the examination table had been designed to contain specimens in various states of consciousness and capability, but they had never been tested against someone who understood their mechanical principles and had spent considerable time studying their weak points. Marcus's engineering background had taught him that every system had failure modes, and his examination of the restraint mechanisms during his previous visits had revealed exactly where those failure modes could be exploited. Dr. Vexthar stumbled backward as his paralyzed specimen began systematically dismantling the restraint system from within. Marcus's movements were precise and economical, betraying no wasted effort or random desperation. This wasn't panic or berserker rage. It was applied engineering principles combined with human stubbornness and wrapped in the kind of focused determination that had built starships from metal and dreams. Impossible, the doctor whispered, his scientific worldview crumbling as Marcus sat up on the examination table and began removing the remaining sensor arrays with the methodical efficiency of someone performing routine maintenance. The neural disruptors, the biological constraints, you should be completely incapacitated. Marcus met the alien's eyes as he stepped down from the table, and Dr. Vexthar saw something there that made his enhanced cardiovascular system spike with primal terror. Not rage or hatred, though both were certainly present. Not desperation or madness, though the situation might have justified either response. What the doctor saw was competence. Absolute, unshakable competence backed by the kind of quiet confidence that came from knowing exactly what needed to be done and having the skills to do it. "You made a mistake," Marcus said calmly as he began examining the chamber's control systems with the practiced eye of someone who understood complex machinery. "You thought the most dangerous thing about humans was our adaptability. But that's not quite right." He located the chamber's primary power conduit and began tracing its connection to the facility's main grid, his movements sure and purposeful despite never having seen Drackery technology before. Engineering principles were universal, and a power distribution system was a power distribution system regardless of who had built it. "The most dangerous thing about humans," Marcus continued, his voice carrying clearly over the chaos erupting throughout the facility, "is that we don't just adapt to survive. We adapt to win. And we never, ever do it alone." Dr. Vex there made a desperate lunge for the emergency alert controls, but Marcus was already moving. The human's response time shouldn't have been possible for someone who had been subjected to neural disruptor bombardment for the past several hours, but possibility had become a negotiable concept in the examination chamber. As the doctor crumpled to the floor, stunned but alive, Marcus had no interest in unnecessary killing. The facility's power grid finally reached the breaking point that had been carefully engineered by dozens of coordinated sabotage efforts. Emergency lighting flickered and died. Backup systems failed to activate properly, and the bioorganic walls began to pulse with the irregular rhythms that indicated systemic breakdown. In the sudden darkness, Marcus heard something that made his chest tighten with fierce pride. The sound of his fellow prisoners fighting not just for their own freedom, but for each other. Battle cries in a dozen different languages, coordinated tactical movements between species that had never worked together before, and underneath it all, the unmistakable harmony of a community that had chosen to stand together against impossible odds. The Drackery had thought they understood what they were dealing with when they captured Marcus Chun. They thought they had acquired a moderately dangerous specimen with interesting cognitive properties. They had no idea they had brought home the catalyst for their own destruction. Because humans didn't just escape from prisons. They liberated them, and they brought everyone home. The corridors of the Crimson Depths had become a battleground unlike anything in recorded galactic history. What should have been a simple containment breach had evolved into something far more complex and terrifying, a coordinated military operation executed by species that had never worked together before, led by a maintenance engineer who had somehow become the most dangerous individual in the Drackery Empire. Marcus moved through the facility with deadly efficiency, no longer the confused prisoner who had been dragged from his cell days ago. The intelligence he had gathered during his examinations, combined with the systematic sabotage his fellow prisoners had inflicted on the facility's systems, had given him something more valuable than any weapon: complete tactical awareness of his environment. Behind him, Dr. Vexthar's examination chamber was already being converted into a field command center by the liberated prisoners who had followed the sounds of combat to their source. Resonance of deep thought had interfaced directly with the chamber's control systems, turning the doctor's own equipment into a coordination hub for the expanding rebellion. The crystalline entity's harmonic communications were now carrying tactical updates between freed prisoners throughout the facility. Marcus, Zephyr's voice reached him through the bioorganic walls as the great dragon approached with a cadre of liberated prisoners trailing behind him. The ancient warrior's eyes blazed with a fire that Marcus had never seen during their conversations through cell barriers. "The main detention levels are secure. 87 confirmed liberations, with more groups reporting successful breakouts from the specialized containment areas." Marcus nodded, his attention split between the tactical update and the facility schematics he was constructing in his mind. The Drackery prison had been designed with multiple redundant security measures, but those same redundancies were now working against its builders. Every backup system that failed created new vulnerabilities, and every security protocol that had been compromised opened new avenues of approach. Casualties, he asked, though he could see from Zephyr's expression that the news wasn't entirely good. Kextal of the Centauri took neural disruptor damage during the initial breakout. He's conscious, but experiencing temporary motor impairment. 3 of the merged ones are dealing with feedback damage from overloading computer systems. And Zephyr paused, his voice taking on a note of profound respect. Whisper of Distant Stars sacrificed significant mass to create the atmospheric disturbances that disabled the guard stations. The entity may not survive in its current form. Marcus felt the familiar tightness in his chest that came with command responsibility. These beings had trusted him with their lives, had believed in his plan despite every rational reason for despair, and now some of them were paying the price for that trust. But this wasn't the time for guilt or second-guessing. His people were depending on him to see this through to the end. Get the wounded to the medical storage areas in Sublevel 5, he said, his voice carrying the calm authority that had somehow emerged during the chaos of the last few hours. The automated medical systems are still functional, and several species can benefit from the generic treatment protocols. Make sure everyone knows that anyone who can't continue fighting needs to fall back to the secured areas immediately. Around them, the sounds of battle were intensifying as the remaining guards attempted to mount a coordinated response to the breakout. But their efforts were being systematically dismantled by prisoners who had spent years studying their captors' tactics and now possessed both the numbers and the coordination to exploit every weakness they had observed. The Hive Singers had established pheromone communication networks that allowed for real-time tactical coordination across the entire facility. The Centauri merchants were using their systems analysis expertise to predict and counter guard movements before they could be implemented. Even the most exotic species were contributing in ways that the Drackery had never anticipated, methods of resistance and rebellion that existed outside their understanding of conventional warfare. Marcus made his way toward the facility's primary control center, the nexus from which all of the Crimson Depths operations were coordinated. Taking that position would give them control over everything from life support systems to the portal generators that connected this pocket dimension to the outside universe. But, more importantly, it would give them access to the High Command's communication networks. The Drackery needed to learn that their perfect prison had fallen. They needed to understand that their systematic underestimation of inferior species had cost them more than just a single facility. And they needed to realize that humanity was about to become a very different kind of problem for their empire. The control center was defended by the facility's most elite guards, bioengineered variants that represented the pinnacle of Drackery military enhancement. They were faster than baseline humans, stronger than most species, and equipped with weapons that could disable or kill anything in the known galaxy. Under normal circumstances, they would have been more than capable of holding their position against any conceivable assault. But these weren't normal circumstances. The attack on the control center wasn't led by a single species using familiar tactics. It was a coordinated assault by dozens of different life forms, each contributing unique capabilities in ways that had never been seen before in galactic warfare. Gas phase entities created atmospheric disturbances that confused tracking systems, while crystalline beings generated electromagnetic interference that blinded sensors. Draconic prisoners provided heavy assault capabilities, while insectoid species used their natural armor and speed to exploit gaps in the defenders' lines. And coordinating it all was Marcus Chun, who moved through the battle like a conductor directing a symphony of destruction. He wasn't the strongest fighter or the most sophisticated tactician, but he understood something that the Dracari guards couldn't comprehend: how to make a group of individuals function as something greater than the sum of their parts. The breakthrough came when Marcus realized that the control center's defenses were designed to repel invasion from the outside, not rebellion from within. The Dracari had never conceived of a scenario where their own prisoners might gain access to the facility's internal systems and use that access to coordinate an assault on the most secure location in the complex. Resonance of Deep Thought provided the key, using its quantum processing capabilities to hack directly into the control center's bioorganic computer networks and begin rewriting fundamental security protocols in real time. The entity's crystalline form pulsed with harmonics that bypassed every encryption system the Dracari had developed, treating their most sophisticated security measures as interesting puzzles rather than insurmountable barriers. The control center's doors unlocked from the inside, their biomechanical systems responding to authorization codes that hadn't existed moments before. The elite guards found themselves facing not just a frontal assault, but also systematic betrayal by their own equipment as weapons failed to fire and armor systems shut down in the middle of combat. Marcus was the first through the breached entrance, moving with a confidence that spoke of absolute tactical certainty. The control center was a marvel of bioorganic engineering, with living walls that pulsed with data streams and control surfaces that responded to direct neural interface. Under different circumstances, he might have spent hours marveling at the sophisticated technology that surrounded him. Instead, he went directly to work. The Dracari communication systems were more advanced than anything in human space, but communication was communication regardless of the technology involved. Marcus's engineering background had taught him to recognize patterns and trace system architectures, skills that translated surprisingly well to alien computer networks. Within minutes, he had established contact with the High Command's central communication hub. The response was immediate and gratifying. Shock, disbelief, and barely controlled panic as the most secure facility in the Dracari Empire reported that it had been completely overrun by its own prisoners. The High Command's initial assumption was that the transmission was some kind of elaborate deception or technical malfunction. No mere collection of specimens could pose a serious threat to the Crimson Depths. Marcus let them cling to their disbelief for several minutes while he established complete control over the facility systems. When he finally activated the main communication array, his image appeared on screens throughout the Dracari command structure. A human face surrounded by the representatives of dozens of species that had supposedly been securely contained in the Empire's most sophisticated prison. "My name is Marcus, Chun," he said, his voice carrying clearly through communication networks that spanned multiple star systems. "I am speaking to you from the control center of what used to be your maximum security detention facility. As you can see, we have made some improvements to your prison administration." The silence that followed his words was profound. Marcus could see the shock registering on alien faces throughout the command hierarchy as they tried to process what they were witnessing. This wasn't supposed to be possible. Prisoners didn't escape from the Crimson Depths, and they certainly didn't take control of the facility's command systems. "You have been operating under several fundamental misconceptions about the species you've been collecting," Marcus continued, his tone conversational despite the enormity of what he was accomplishing. "You've been categorizing us by individual capabilities and treating us as isolated specimens rather than recognizing what we become when we work together." Behind him, the liberated prisoners were taking their positions at control stations throughout the center. Zephyr stood at the tactical display, his ancient warrior's instincts perfectly suited for managing the defensive systems that protected the facility from outside attack. Resonance of deep thought had interfaced directly with the data processing networks, its crystalline form pulsing with information flows that would have overwhelmed any biological nervous system. The sight of dozens of supposedly inferior species operating Dracari technology with casual competence was having a visible effect on the High Command's composure. Marcus could see doubt beginning to creep into expressions that had initially shown only contempt and dismissal. But the real lesson here isn't about individual species or their capabilities, Marcus said, activating displays that showed the systematic failures that had led to the facility's fall. It's about what happens when you underestimate the power of hope. You thought you had broken us, cataloged us, reduced us to manageable components in your collection. You had no idea that you had simply given us time to find each other. He gestured toward his fellow prisoners, and the communication system faithfully transmitted their images to screens throughout the Dracari Empire. These beings come from dozens of different worlds, represent completely different evolutionary paths, speak languages that have nothing in common with each other. Under normal circumstances, most of them would never have any reason to cooperate, and some would be natural enemies. Marcus paused, letting that information register before delivering the conclusion that he knew would terrify them more than any military threat. But you put them in cages next to each other. You gave them a common enemy, a shared purpose, and, most importantly, you gave them time to learn that they could trust each other. And now they've learned something else. They're stronger together than they ever were apart. The communication channel erupted with demands, threats, and attempts at negotiation, but Marcus wasn't finished. He activated the facility's portal systems, the massive generators that maintain the connection between the pocket dimension and normal space. The energy readings that appeared on screens throughout the Dracari command structure told a story that even the most optimistic military analyst couldn't misinterpret. "We're leaving now," Marcus said simply. "All of us. Together. And we're taking your technology with us, along with every piece of intelligence we've gathered about your empire's operations. But before we go, I want you to understand something important." He looked directly into the communication array's pickups, knowing that his words were being transmitted to every command center and strategic planning facility in Dracari space. Humanity didn't conquer the galaxy through superior firepower or advanced technology. We earned our place in the cosmos by doing something that apparently never occurred to you. We helped other species become more than they thought possible. And now, thanks to your own actions, we're about to do it again. The portal generators reached full activation as Whisper of Distant Stars, despite its weakened condition, began coordinating the atmospheric disturbances necessary to safely transport the liberated prisoners back to normal space. The entity's sacrifice had provided the crucial distraction during the initial breakout, and now its expertise was ensuring that everyone would make it home safely. Marcus watched the dimensional barriers dissolve as the first groups of freed prisoners began their journey back to the galaxy they had thought they would never see again. Species that had been enemies were helping each other through the portal transitions. Beings that had never communicated before were sharing resources and providing mutual support. The community that had been forged in the depths of despair was remaining intact as they returned to freedom. Zephyr approached as the final evacuation protocols activated, the great dragon's expression mixing respect, gratitude, and something that might have been wonder. "In all my years of warfare, I have never seen anything like what you accomplished here. Not just the escape, though that was remarkable enough, but what you did to us, what you helped us become. Marcus looked around the control center one last time, taking in the sight of dozens of different species working together with seamless coordination. I didn't do this. We all did this. I just reminded everyone that it was possible. The last of the prisoners passed through the portal as the facility's systems began their controlled shutdown sequence. The Crimson Depths would remain intact, but it would be empty, its purpose as a symbol of Dracari's superiority destroyed forever. The pocket dimension would collapse harmlessly within a few hours, leaving no trace of the prison that had once held the galaxy's most dangerous specimens. But the real damage to the Dracari Empire wouldn't come from the destruction of a single facility. It would come from a knowledge that their supposedly inferior prisoners had not only escaped, but had done so by becoming something that challenged every assumption about species hierarchy and military organization. As Marcus stepped through the portal and felt normal space-time reassert itself around him, he carried with him the satisfaction of a job well done and the knowledge that he had kept his promise. Everyone had made a home. The community they had built would survive and grow, spreading throughout the galaxy as its members returned to their worlds and shared the lessons they had learned about cooperation, trust, and the power of refusing to accept defeat. Behind them, the Dracari Empire would spend the coming months dealing with the implications of what had happened in the Crimson Depths. They would strengthen their security protocols, redesign their prison systems, and implement new procedures for handling captured specimens. But they would never quite be able to forget the sight of their most secure facility being dismantled by the very beings they had thought they controlled. And throughout the galaxy, whispered stories would begin to spread about the human who had reminded everyone that hope was not just possible, but powerful, and that sometimes the most dangerous weapon you could give someone was simply the chance to find out what they were truly capable of when they stopped fighting alone. The universe had been reminded why humanity was feared not for their strength or their technology, but for their stubborn refusal to let anyone fight their battles alone. And in the years to come, that reminder would reshape the balance of power among the stars in ways that no one, not even Marcus Chun, could have fully anticipated. Sometimes the most profound revolutions began not with grand gestures or overwhelming force, but with one person deciding that everyone deserved to go home.